Today we'll be talking about aligning business with IT through prototyping. And let me go ahead and show my screen here. And I'd like to remind everybody here that this webinar will be recorded. And for those of you who can't make it, or if you have colleagues who are interested in the topic but are unable to make it, we'll make this available. We'll email this out after the webinar is over, and feel free to disperse with your colleagues. Also, like to remind everybody that you are muted. However, if you do have questions that come up as we go through this webinar, in your interface, there is a section, if you pull down the questions tab, you can type in your questions there throughout the webinar. And at the end of the session, we'll have a time for Q&A. Let me start with introductions. So there we go. My name is Stephen Liu. I'm an enterprise solutions specialist here at Justinmind. And my job here is to work with enterprise clients and to figure out how we can use prototyping in the SDLC and to streamline the communications of software requirements. And joined by me is our lead product manager, Victor Canessa, and I'll let him introduce himself.
I'm Victor. I've been a product manager for 10 years now, and I've seen many big companies and small companies struggling with requirements and prototyping. And I will just share my experience with you guys and be glad to answer any questions that you might have at the end of the webinar.
All right, thank you, Victor. So the agenda for today is we'll spend about 15 minutes or so initially going over the top level topic here, which is we'll describe the business case for prototyping. And we'll spend about 15 minutes there. And then we'll spend the majority of this webinar actually in the product itself. And this is where the rubber meets the road. We're going to actually build a mock application starting from scratch. And we'll go through and hopefully clarify some things with prototyping. We'll, of course, use Justinmind. We'll be using the Enterprise Edition. The idea here is to actually see how a project can be evolved from low fidelity to high fidelity, how it can be tracked with requirements management, and how it can be used to leverage some of the communication issues that you might otherwise encounter with prototyping. And lastly, we'll save about 15-20 minutes at the end for question and answer. So let's get started. Let's first establish some context here. So here's the reality of the world that we live in. Basically, the world runs on software. This is no surprise to us, of course. Whether you're a manufacturing company that depend on ERPs for your supply chain management, or if you're a bank that you rely on software for the transfer of money, or maybe you're a retailer and you need software for your POS or your inventory management, or if you're a tech company, the reality is that software is everywhere. It's the engine that keeps most companies going. And this, of course, is compounded through the years as cloud computing has become the norm. The reality is that, software is everywhere. It is also really hard to build. And this is a report done by the Standish Group based out of the UK in 2014. They surveyed over 380 different companies. And these are the numbers that they came up with. And as you can see, they're pretty abysmal. For large companies especially, the average IT budget is considered around $2.4 million, but only 9% are considered successful, meaning they were done on time and within budget. And almost 30% are canceled altogether, meaning they never even see the light of day. The statistics are not much better for small or medium companies. And in fact, they're a little worse for small companies in terms of project cancellations. But unfortunately, this is the state of the industry. This is the problem that we're trying to fix. And let's dive a little deeper into why that is. And I'd like to break the ice with this fun cartoon here. And on the top left-hand corner, you'll see that there's a picture of how the customer explained it, right? It being what they need. And compare that to the bottom right-hand corner where It's a picture of what the customer actually wanted, right? And you can see already from the get-go, this project is already doomed to fail. It's already there's already communication issues within the first step. And the reason why you and I are here is because we are the people that communicate the software requirements to the next group, or if you're a project manager, or if you're a UX designer. It's why Justinmind is here. We're here to basically facilitate communication. And you can see all these different pictures. My favorite one is the bottom left-hand corner of how the project was documented. And of course, there's nothing there. And I think it's a perfect representation of what actually happens when we try to document complex IT projects. Let's go even further and look at why projects succeed or fail. This is the same report done by the Standish Group, and they came up with like the top 10 reasons of why projects succeed and fail. And I'll give you a couple seconds here just to kind of glance that over. Hopefully you'll see a trend or a common theme. And let me just highlight that real quick. Hopefully that's a little more obvious. The issue here is communication. Projects succeed or fail primarily based on how the team communicates. It's less to do with the competency of the staff or the technology. It has everything to do with communication. And you can see user involvement, statement of requirements, proper planning, realistic expectations, clear vision and objectives, and user input, change in requirements and spec. And you can even argue that unrealistic timeframes over here at number 9 on the why projects fail could also be a communication issue as well. And looking at a typical SDLC, you'll find most likely, whether it's a waterfall or an agile environment or anything in between, there's going to be at least these 3 phases. You're going to have a definition phase, a design, and a development phase. And throughout each one of these phases, communication is handled in different ways in different companies. But what we've seen in our experience is that documents, static documents, kind of run the show here. So from the first stage of definition to the next stage of design, you have maybe requirements documents, maybe a use case flow diagram, or even sometimes a wireframe or a screenshot. Some users this will be where you put static mock-ups of maybe you'll just draw boxes and lines in PowerPoint presentation. It can be as simple as that. It can be as simple as a whiteboard sketch that you take a picture of your phone and you put into your document. And as a project evolves, of course, we add more to the requirements document package because there's more requirements now. There's more elaborate requirements. There's also more use cases, right? And there's also maybe at this point you have a static mock-up with some pixels. And as the project evolves even further, maybe at this point you interject QA test documents, maybe even a dynamic prototype. Typically it's done by your developers if you don't have a prototyping team or UX team. And as it's reiterated, of course, we add rework documents. And so as you can see, documents dominate the communication of requirements. And the question is there a better way to communicate? So with that said, I'd like to kind of propose this idea of a prototype. And before we even look at software prototyping, let's define what a prototype is. So for that, we take some inspiration from parallel industries. So here's a prototype of a car. Here's one of a guitar in its early stages. It's still actually a model. And here's one of a building. So what do these have in common? Well, it's a visual validation. A prototype visually validates what's on paper, right? So if this were a set of engineering drawings, to interpret that on top of each other would be nearly impossible for your head to wrap around. So we have a visual validation of what that looks like in 3-dimensional form. It's meant to be tested, of course, and I come from the world of mechanical engineering where models are actually stress tested. And the same can be applied for software as well. What else do they do? Well, there's something to be patterned after. Usually a prototype is the first of a kind. So it's a model for your production folks to model after. And it also evolves. And this very concept is the core of prototyping, is that as we see something and if it doesn't fit or if it doesn't work, it has the agility to pivot and evolve based on new requirements or new test cases or new user experiences. So let's hop over to software prototyping. What is a software prototype? It's the same thing. It's a visual validation of requirements in this case. It's meant to be tested, right, on real users before you go live into production. It's something to pattern after for developers so that they have something to look at when they're coding instead of just a stack of documents. And it also evolves. Again, we've talked about this, and this is really important for software prototyping because even more than physical objects, software prototypes tend to change even more. So it's crucial that the tool that you use to prototype has flexibility for change. What is the value of prototyping? Well, we like for it to decrease the rework and development time, and that all of that translates to cost. And at the same time, increasing communication, which we've talked about, and engagement to the folks in your company, to your stakeholders, to your users, to the management, everybody that's involved. And hopefully that turns into higher adoption, meaning less help desk tickets for your support team, more productivity from the people that are using the software. And I like to kind of introduce this concept of, well, what do you look for in a prototype? There's a lot of tools out there, but ideally, you'd like to look for one that's easy to use, of course. In our day and age, we just don't have time to invest in extensive training. It's costly and it's expensive and it delays production. And it should be solutions driven. And while this seems intuitive, a lot of software out there, there's a lot of software out there, first of all, and a lot of them sell themselves as solutions, but in reality, they're actually bigger problems, and you're actually introducing more problems into your processes than solutions. It's got to be versatile, meaning it's simple and powerful. And again, with prototyping, you ideally like to go from low to high fidelity, all within the same tool. So it should have versatility that can carry that communication change. And also, it's got to be cross-functional. We understand that there's multiple people involved in an SDLC. You have people that think very differently. A designer is going to think very differently than a project manager. A product manager is going to think very differently than a developer. And a developer is going to think very differently than the director of this whole project. So we have multiple people looking at this from multiple perspectives. And ideally, this is something that can be the platform that carries that communication. So at this point, I'd like to switch gears and go into the actual product itself. So again, I want to take this time to remind everybody that if you do have questions, please feel free to type that in to the questions section in your interface, and then we'll get to that at the end. So, all right, let me pull up our application here. And actually, before I do that, let me show some examples of prototypes. And if you guys were to go into our webpage, justinmind.com, on the top right, you'll see a menu. And if you're looking for inspiration, there's some great examples that we've built in Justinmind. So if you go down to examples, here's some examples of prototypes that we built with the application. These were not coded. These were built with Justinmind. And then the HTML was just simply extracted and put on this page. One of the most common questions we ask is your prototyper capable of responsive and or adaptive design? The answer is yes. Here's an example of the responsiveness. And also you can see once we get to here, there's a breakpoint there. So this is the adaptive feature. Let's look at some other examples. Here's a fun one. This is a music player. And this particular example is great because it'll showcase complex logic. So like, for example, if I were to log in with a bogus login, it's actually not going to let me. I can sign up with this feature and actually create a login. Let's just create a simple login, confirm the password. We'll save that variable. And now if I go back in, I can log in with the account that I just created. And you can see there, you can see the side menu. You can see, if you hit the play, you can see the scroll bar. There's a music volume adjuster as well. You can rotate this for a rotated display. Let's look at another example here. Here's a good one. Here's an example of I guess a health insurance or a healthcare website, and you can navigate through the different tabs up top. You can also log in with credentials that are built in. I want to go to this form here. You can see here there's drop-down menus. We can input fields, live input fields. There's also customized fields, like for example, here's a date field. So if I put in January 1st, 1920 or something, and I hit tab, there's a calculator that calculates my age, and so on and so forth. We'll get into more of the complex logic and expression builder later on, but I wanted to show you guys some examples of high fidelity prototypes. So these are ones that are fully built out. These would then be artifacts that could be handed off to your developers. So they've gone through the gambit of testing with users and reiterating before you hand off to your developers. And so wanted to showcase some of the capabilities of Justinmind. And of course, you can mess around with, there's even more examples here in the bottom that you can play around with. So I encourage you guys to do that when you get a chance. But let's go ahead and actually build one. So we're going to go into create a new prototype. And from here, from the application, you can select from a bunch of different templates. We have iPhone and Android, of course. There's customized interfaces, customized resolution for those who are not building mobile app or web. There's also Google Glass. For our example, let's just use a web. And also, there's some preloaded examples. If you're looking to figure out how to do parallax design or adaptive design, for example, you can see kind of how we build that within the prototyper. Let me just start from a clean slate. And as the application is loading, let me just set the stage for what we're doing. Basically, we're going to build a simple application. We've been commissioned to build a 2-screen application. It's basically a login screen, and then it'll take us to a home screen. Very simple. That's all we know at this point. And we're going to flesh out the ideas as we use Justinmind to build this prototype. So typically, if you're in any kind of enterprise setting, I'm guessing that there's a requirements function. So within Justinmind, if you click the top right, actually before I do that, let me turn on my mouse highlighter. There we go. If you go on the top right, you'll see this requirements tab. And if you hit that, this will bring you to a requirements management environment. From here, you can create new requirements if you want. So if you don't have a requirements management system, this can actually be a very simple way to gather your requirements. So you can create new requirements. You can also import requirements. So if you do have some sort of ALM system, you can import requirements via CSV. So I have here just a simple requirements document in a CSV form that I'm going to import. And there it is. I can see that the author is Victor, and he says to make a button, whatever that means, right? But you can see here, there's that requirement. And you can also export requirements as well. I'm not going to do that right now, but it's a really handy way to streamline the requirements process. And at this point, maybe you're ready to start sketching out these screens. So you can actually jump over to the Scenarios tab. And in this environment, you can plop out your concepts for what you want to build. So like right now, we know that we got to have a login screen and a home screen that we're going to build. And you can grab this arrow and create navigation cues as well. You can also use this to create simple flowcharts. Like for example, if you can turn this note into, let's say, make this background white. There's decision trees, and you can use this in the same way that you'd use Microsoft Visio to create sort of a decision tree. And let me just get rid of this here, actually. From here, maybe what you want to do is start creating the first wireframe. So once you have this built out, however complex or simple as you like, one way to do that is to right-click and say Create also in UI, User Interface. And that will create the slate for you. And if you jump back to the Scenarios tab, you can see there's a preview of the screen that you just created. Of course, there's nothing there because we haven't done anything. But let me do the same thing for the home screen. So now we have our login screen and the home screen. And let me just quickly make the login as the initial screen, and then we can get rid of this default one here. All right, so we have two screens, and at this point, if you want to start wireframing, of course, we have basic widgets here that you can actually just start clicking and dragging. Everything in Justinmind is code-free, meaning that you don't need to know how to code. Everything is clicking and dragged, and you can make this, as simple or as complex as you're comfortable with at this point. Maybe what you want to do is also, a lot of people would, before they even get to a prototyper, they want to be able to draw something out on paper or a whiteboard and then import that image into the prototyper. You can do that as well. I have just a simple interface here that I drew up just by hand. So for example, pretend this is your team meeting, your initial kickoff meeting, and then you said, okay, this is what we're going to do. Well, from here, you can also create hotspots. So I would have put a hotspot over that button. I can then make this hotspot essentially live and link. If I want this to link to the home screen, all I got to do is click and drag that on top of the home screen. And now this is a live navigation. To check that at any time, if you want to see what you just built, click that big green button on the top there. And we have as you can see the mouse over, there's definitely an action there. If I click it, it takes us to the home screen. Of course, there's nothing there, but you can see that it works. And let's just say, if you don't like the hotspot, well, of course, you can always just build actual assets on top of this as well. So I'm going to do that. Drag in some input fields like so. We'll make this button, we'll call this login or something like that. And then at this point, maybe we're ready to just get rid of this background. And there we have our login widget, right? And you're thinking, well, I don't want to do this every time I create a login page. Is there a way to save this widget? Yes, there is. So within Justinmind, you can create custom widgets. So if I were to say new widget library, I'm going to call this webinar widget lib. Click OK. And now you can see in the bottom left, it created a custom widget library. And what I want to do is save this widget. So I'm going to group this and just click this and drag that. Whoops. Click this and drag that right into the widget group. Actually, let me just make sure that I grab the whole thing here. And I'm going to save this as new widget 1. And if I were to bring this back, whoops, you know what? I did not drag the whole widget. Gotta make sure I grab this entire guy there. There we go. Call it new widget 2. And now if I were to reuse this, you can see that you don't have to do creation process again. Now, this is a very simple example, but imagine if this were more complex. This could be a huge time saver for you. And maybe at this point, you're ready to share this with your initial set of reviewers. So a real simple way to do that is click this big blue button up top. And what it's doing now is it's essentially creating a web page. It's taking the prototype that we just made, and it's creating an HTML file, and then it's uploading that file into a cloud server. For enterprise customers, instead of uploading to the cloud, this is uploaded to your server. So we have the ability for enterprise customers to install a collaboration server behind your firewall, which gives you full control over the prototypes. It also lets you create user repositories that lets you assign users to different projects. For our example, we're just going to use the cloud here. We're going to call this webinar demo. And so it's uploading to the cloud, and then now it's asking me, let's see, let me do that again here. I think webinar demo, share that, and there we go, it's publishing. And I'm going to view that in my online account. So it's bringing up my online management page. So every user would have this interface. It allows you to invite reviewers and manage your project. So like you can, for example, if you were to click on invite reviewers, you can invite them by email. You can also create user groups as well. So if you have, let's say, a group of alpha testers or beta testers and a group of developers, you can customize those groups and invite them accordingly. And what you're going to see is actually when they get the email, they would get the ability to click and view the prototype. So you can see that from a reviewer's perspective, they can test out these widgets that we just created. Of course, these are low fidelity. And at any time they want to comment, they can flip this toggle on the top here into comment mode on. And now this cursor turns into a crosshair, and it highlights elements within the page or the general page itself. If you want to comment on any feature, all you gotta do is just hit any feature and just say, you know, this is this needs more work or something like that. And someone else could come in and see your comment there. They can click that and say, sure does. And of course, you can see that it creates a conversation cascade. So it organizes comments instead of just being a general page with lines and lines of comments. This is actually cascaded into elements. And how this translates to the application is, so let's actually go back to Justinmind. If you say share and refresh comments, this will then pull in all of the comments that we just created. So on the bottom here, you'll see these are those two comments that I just made. One says this needs more work. The other one says sure does. What's also nice is you can actually right click and turn that into a requirement as well. Let me jump back into the requirements section for a second. You can remember there's those two requirements that we initially created. Now imagine there's hundreds of lines of requirements. It's hard to maintain and keep track of requirements. One easy way to do this with Justinmind is you can tag requirements to features. For example, there's a functional requirement for button. If I were to jump back into the user interface and pull up the requirements, and if I just click that requirement into, let's just say, this button right here, I can link those two components. I can link that requirement to that button right there, and you can see the related component says button 3, component of login. Now, if you were to go back into the requirements pane, if you right click and say show component, this will then take you to, and it'll highlight whichever component that it's tied to. So real useful way to keep organized and maintain that you don't lose track of your requirements. So at this point, maybe we're ready to add more fidelity. And of course, this is not a technical demo. I don't have enough time to possibly show everything that Justinmind is capable of, but let me just talk about a couple things. For example, if you were to create complex events. Let me just bring up the event window. So you can, of course, click on the mouse, right click, left click, mouse over, toggle in, keyboard gestures. If this is mobile, you can do mobile gestures on pinch, swipe, rotate, etc. You can also trigger based on page load or unload, based on window resize. This is where you do adaptive design. Scroll, this is where you can do parallax. And also, once it's triggered, there's another complex set of events that you can do. You can link to something, you can change the style, you can show or hide a dynamic panel, you can set the value of a table, and so on and so forth. There's even database mimicry. You don't need to have any database knowledge, but if you have simple functions that you want to search for, we actually within Justinmind allows you to mimic database behavior. Let me bring up the expression builder. And of course, this is one of the most complex and powerful expression builders on the market. You can see here that you can calculate, remember the example earlier when we calculated the age. There's numeric functions, there's comparators, text functions for searching a database, and so on and so forth. If you guys do have, I know there's a lot of users out there already. We have one of the most extensive knowledge bases online. Feel free to go on justinmind.com and go to our support section. Tons of information if you guys are looking for technical support. And let me, at this point, highlight the teamwork feature. So in enterprise settings, I'm guessing that you're probably not the only person. I'm guessing you probably work within a team of people, whether it's designers, but also developers and PMs and business analysts. You're probably going to be working with people. And so the teamwork feature is really handy. From here, you can share the prototype with teammates. You can also manage your shared prototypes, add, remove users. There's also a neat function to show the history. So if you want to go back to an earlier save point, once a teammate commits to a section or a screen, you can go back and start from that save point as well. The other thing that's useful with teamwork is within the enterprise edition, you can share your widget libraries with your teammates as well. So rather than having to export the library, this is also something you can use. Basically, the export function creates a file of the widget that you just created. But if you use the share function, what this does is it's an instantaneous update with your teammates so that you don't have to export and then email those or put them on an FTP. This will be an instantaneous share. And with that said, that's basically the bulk of what we wanted to get through in the technical portion. I'd like to open up this time for questions. So let's bring Victor into the conversation and let's take a look at some questions.
Well, hello everyone. We have a bunch of questions that we'll be really glad to answer. Someone asked a really interesting question. That is how developers will consume the prototypes. Right? Once you have built a prototype that is actually being validated by the right stakeholders, and so, okay, what's the next step? Right? There are many things that you can do when you have a prototype. Of course, developers can just have the link to the prototype and use it as a reference for their development, and just to use it like a baseline and just make sure that what they are building looks like the prototype. I mean, that's one way. Well, that's one thing that they can do. Another thing that they also can do is to use the document generated within the product. There is this option that you can find within the product that lets you export all the information into a specifications document that you can then pass over to the developers, just to have a more detailed description of what you have built in the prototype. That's another option. Another thing that they can also do is to fill their already existing like issue tracker, like Jira or whatever tool they are using to track the project tasks. They can just export all the requirements and then import all those requirements into Jira, for instance, and then turn that into the task and into the project's backlog. And that's another thing. And finally, there's even another thing that they can do, which is pretty cool, which is actually reuse anything from the prototype and generate real working code. So we have this option that is the API that is completely free for enterprise clients, and it's a completely developed SDK that developers can use. And with this API, they can access to all the information within a prototype by code, and then generate like the first version of the new product or the new project, just using that. Another question is, do other prototyping tools simulate responsive design? As for prototyping tools in the market right now, the most complex ones besides Justinmind, they just get into the adaptive thing. I mean, the most complex thing they can do is to define breakpoints, but that will make you will need you to build like every or a different screen or a different set of content for each of the breakpoints. So as far as I know, there are no other prototyping tools that also, besides adaptive, also let you simulate responsive. Another question is, this is a really good one. What fidelity of design should you use for prototyping to communicate requirements and user flows? Well, my suggestion is that use the highest level of fidelity that your users will be able to understand. The more realistic the prototype, the better the feedback. But if you feel like your final client will not get that that's just a prototype, and he will think that it's actually something that is real, or that you have this kind of client or stakeholder that is always or complaining about colors and these sort of things. If you have that case for that specific users, then it might be better to just get into a lower level of fidelity. And by fidelity, I mean design. I mean colors and fonts and so on. I don't mean interaction. You can always add as much interaction as you want, even if you're you're working with a low fidelity prototype. In the end, it's all about validating not just the design, but also the experience, right? Okay, more questions. How to manage requirements and also expectations with prototyping? This is a really good question as well, because and a really good suggestion is when you are going to show a prototype for the first time to a client, make sure that you tell him that it's just a prototype, that it took you very little time to build, it's not a real application, and that he's free to provide any feedback, because it will be really quick to do any kind of change in that prototype. That way you overcome two things. One is the expectation of that they might think that it's actually something that you already built. And the other one that sometimes happens is that if you have something like this very interactive and realistic, which is pretty quick and easy to do with Justinmind in this case, is that the stakeholder might be reluctant to give you any feedback because it might look that you put a lot of effort building that prototype, and he might be like, oh, well, if I tell him to change, this huge section, it will take ages. Just make sure that what they are seeing is something that can be easily changed, and that way you can get the best feedback possible. So some people ask if there is a learning curve to get started. And well, with any complex tools, it will depend on your previous experience and the kind of products that you're used to work with. But we have a pretty good set of getting started videos here in the support section in the website that you can use. So if you want to master this tool, the first step would be just to get to this section and watch these 3 getting started tutorials, getting from there. And then if you actually want to get deeper on that, there are a bunch of tutorials that they are divided by expertise, if you mind. So you can always come here and learn about how to simulate events and how to simulate conditions and variables. All the tutorials are ordered by expertise, right? So in this section, you can just start one by one, and you will get more and more proficient with this tool. Okay, more questions coming out. Does the TeamWorks support versioning at all? Yes. Yeah, exactly. So the TeamWork, Steve have shown how it works very briefly, but it supports version. It's a check-in, check-out kind of process, and it's at the level of screens and scenarios. So you can, if one of your team members can work on a screen, he needs to lock that screen first. So, and that way he's sure that nobody else will mess around with the things that he's working on at that moment. And then another person can take in a different screen. And when they are done, they can just commit the changes, and that will create a new version for the prototype. If you want to know more about that, there is actually a whole section, the support section in our website, talking about the details on how the TeamWork feature works. Just one last question to answer now. Says, can Justinmind do mind maps? If not mind maps, be imported into Justinmind? Well, the scenario section covers that in a very good way, but you can always go and copy and paste any screenshot from any other diagramming tool into Justinmind and just put some hotspots on top of the elements that you have in that image. And that's another workaround that you can use. Can you see the prototypes in a real mobile device? Yes, that's already built in the tool, and we have this app that is available for Android and iOS. And just with the click of a button, you send the prototype to your own device, and then you can test that prototype in your device, or even you can invite other users to see the prototype in their own devices. Yeah, and one last question. This is going to be the last one for sure. Do the people that I invite to a prototype need a license? No. Just the users that are actually building and sharing the prototypes need a license. You can invite an unlimited number of people to check your prototypes and give you feedback on that. And with that said, let me pass the control to Steve. And if you have any additional questions, please just let us know, and we'll be pleased to answer them back by email.